Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we're returning to 1981 for the first of the Archie Goodwin, Al Williamson newspaper strips this time. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. Now, Archie Goodwin has been part of the newspaper strip series for a little while now. We saw Russ Manning give it over to Rick Hoberg, his assistant, just briefly for the end of the Frozen World of Ota. Then we had Archie Goodwin come in, first under a pseudonym, Russ Helm, for Planet of Cadril, and then as himself, as the adapter of Brian Daley's novel Han Solo at Star's End into comic strip form. Up until now, though, when we've seen Archie Goodwin with the newspaper strips, the artist has been Alfredo Alcala. I've been saying Alcala, my thanks to Lestat Albert, which I may have mispronounced also, one of our YouTube viewers, for pointing out how you're supposed to say his name. Finally here, we have Al Williamson joining him for the newspaper strips, and that's a big deal. They worked together on the Empire Strikes Back adaptation for Marvel Comics. Now, this is going to be the run that most people think of when we think of the classic newspaper strips. It's Goodwin and Williamson, that pairing that really set these apart and sort of made a name for this series in the Star Wars saga. We know this usually under the name of Classic Star Wars. So, we'll tend to see this in the pages of this particular comic series. You can hardly see the classic there, but this is Classic Star Wars #1, originally released by Dark Horse Comics. Their first attempt at taking all these classic newspaper strips, taking out the redundancies, re-editing them, adding a little bit of new artwork in some cases to make the story flow better, and releasing them as individual comics. We're going to see here that there are some odd ways this has been collected, and it's not really a story-by-story collection, at least not in terms of the way that the issues are divided up, but we're going to get to that. Now, as most of you out there who've been watching this series already know, the newspaper strips were put out by the Los Angeles Times newspaper syndicate, and they started with Russ Manning, as mentioned, with Gambler's World. Those later on were collected as Classic Star Wars The Early Adventures, as we've previously seen, outside of the Kashyyyk Depths, and then Planet of Cadril, the first one under Goodwin as Russ Helm. There was a collection, though, of this Goodwin and Williamson run that was released prior to Dark Horse Comics getting their hands on it. Dark Horse Comics became the Star Wars licensee for comic books in 1991. In the years preceding that, we had this project already going on to bring these newspaper strips together that was finally released, appropriately enough, in 1991. Presumably the very last possible moment it could be released prior to Dark Horse being the one taking over the reins and them essentially being shut down in the process of doing this other project. It's a project that I've referred to many times as my collecting holy grail that I finally got my hands on for several $100s a few years ago. It's one that we featured in a segment for my Expanding the Universe segment on Star Wars Action News, for instance. It is the Russ Cochran Publishing newspaper strip collection. This is a huge 3-volume, slip-cased set, and it's simply entitled Star Wars, written by Archie Goodwin, drawn by Al Williamson, rather than being referred to as Classic Star Wars or Star Wars newspaper strips or anything like that. Again, it's a 3-volume set here. The story we're looking at this time is in Volume 1, but let's take a look at each very quickly. This is Volume 1. We'll come back to it. This is Volume 2. And then we have, with the Night Beast on the cover, Volume 3 here. Now, Volume 1 is particularly special, and this is something that kind of goes in line with what David Noche was originally talking about when he suggested this particular series to highlight both the Star Wars things in publishing order and my collection at the same time. Why I call this a holy grail is that these are all signed and individually numbered from a limited edition of 2,500, signed by Archie Goodwin and Al Williamson, both of whom have now passed away, making it impossible to get any new autographs from them. So I was very excited to finally get my hands on this particular series, and what this series does is basically what you would expect, and I've done a video review of this, you can look at the YouTube channel for it, is take the original newspaper strips and collect them with no tweaking, no editing, no removing redundancies, nothing like that. Nothing like what Dark Horse did when re-editing this series for new audiences. This is simply a collection of the original newspaper strips, along with all those little filler panels for some of the newspapers out there that had slightly different design layouts than most of the others in the country had. It's an interesting series. And as we go along with classic Star Wars, this Williamson and Goodwin era of classic Star Wars, I'm going to be letting you know which ones of these and which ones of the classic Star Wars individual issues will have each individual story in it, along with the trade paperback. So if you're trying to find these, you'll know where to find them. Because, of course, they were reprinted on StarWars.com's hyperspace section before it became the dumbed-down Pretty Pictures website that it is now, and they stopped being up on their servers. Yeah, I'm going to be beating that dead horse for a while because I'm so shocked that such great content did get removed. So, the first story of this is The Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell, and that should sound familiar because, of course, it's based on the line in The Empire Strikes Back, the bounty hunter we ran into at Ord Mantell changed my mind. It's supposed to be a telling of the story in which Han encounters the bounty hunter that freaks him out so much that he decides to eventually leave the Rebel Alliance to pay off Jabba the Hutt, rather than endangering them and keeping himself in bad straits with Jabba the Hutt. Now, this is a newspaper strip series that ran from February 9th through April 19th of 1981, so we're already past The Empire Strikes Back in terms of release. Again, that was where Williamson and Goodwin first collaborated, at least in Star Wars, for that adaptation from Marvel Comics. In this case, the bounty hunter in question is named Score. He is one of the many who can take this slot as the bounty hunter that causes Han to change his mind. In the individual issues from Dark Horse Comics, you have issue number 1, this is all the Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell. And then in issue number 2, if you go up to page 15, and you get to this panel right up here at the top, where it says, those we caught will pay dearly for this deception, or excuse me, those we caught will pay for this deception dearly, that's it. That is where we split between the Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell and the next story, Darth Vader Strikes. There is no attempt whatsoever in this series to split up the storylines exactly for each issue, because some of them had more newspaper strips than others, some required more re-editing than others. Would have been a nightmare to try to do that. You can also find these, of course, in the collection of classic Star Wars, the first volume of which is sometimes just called Volume 1 on the early printings, and which is now tending to be referred to, even on the Dark Horse digital comics app, as Volume 1 in Deadly Pursuit. So a lot of ways you could find this particular story. The idea here is pretty simple. Luke and Leia are scouting for a new rebel base. They wind up on a jungle planet where there are already Imperials present for an Imperial base. They need to get out of there. Han Solo is the one who takes the initiative to go and find them and save them because the Rebel Alliance can't spare any more ships to do so. He gets him out of there. They stop on Ord Mantell, and while there, he's recognized by Score, this bounty hunter who wants to get that bounty from Jabba the Hutt. He winds up capturing Princess Leia, capturing Luke, and using them against Han as sort of a bargaining chip to get him to turn himself in so that he could then get the money from Jabba, though in theory, he could have kept Luke and Leia to get money from the Empire had he wanted to. Eventually, our heroes get free. Basically, Han saves Luke and Leia. They wind up falling down and being picked up by the tractor beam of this cargo-hauling airspeeder type thing that Chewbacca is flying. They get back to the Millennium Falcon, get back into space, and evade both Score and the Imperials by essentially luring Score into the Imperials' tractor beam so he can be captured while they escape. Very straightforward story, but the clash with Score is supposedly the thing that gives us that line in The Empire Strikes Back. Problem is, that's one of these things in Star Wars that repeatedly authors want to tell. They want to tell how we got the Death Star plans. They want to tell how Luke gets his lightsaber. They want to tell about the first confrontation between certain characters. Well, in this case, this is one of those stories that is repeatedly being told. Mainly, we tend to believe that the encounter that actually leads to that line is the one in classic Star Wars. It's the more mainstream, the more well-known one, but it's not the only one. In 1983, we had Brian Daley, the guy that is most responsible for writing these Star Wars radio dramas, writing a story called Rebel Mission to Ord Mantell, in which, again, they wind up running across a bounty hunter, this one named Cypher Boss, and they have to, get away from him in the process of doing their regular mission. What makes that story, which is pretty much a throwaway story, somewhat memorable, is two things. One, it also, in 1983, 2 years after this, was trying to tell the story of how that whole bounty hunter thing came about that led to the line in Empire Strikes Back, but it is also an audio drama. It is one of the few Star Wars audio dramas based on new tales. In fact, I would say that it is the only one, kind of thinking back at all the ones we've seen, except for Smuggler's Gambit from Celebration 6. I mean, it's the only original Star Wars audio drama not based on some previously existing material, and it's the only time that Brian Daley is writing an audio drama that's not pre-existing material, because the previous stuff that he was doing was, of course, based on the films. Now, this particular one took me a while to find. This is, I kid you not, an LP. Yes, it is a record for a record player. cutesy little story. It's called Rebel Mission to Ord Mantell, a story from the Star Wars saga. I like the fact that they've got the little subtitle going on there, kind of like they did with some of the other read-along books. There's no book to it, there's no pictures to it, it literally just is an audio tale. A decent little tale, fun to check out. They're sort of reusing some of the art. That's art actually there on the back from the Droid World kids read-along book that we looked at a while back with the Droid World Marvel series issue. But a good story, but again, another retelling of the same thing. We're not going to tend to cover this because it's an audio drama, but it is something that fits to bring up here, as I've hinted at back in a previous episode. Now, knowing that this story had already been told in 1981 in The Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell in the newspaper strips, knowing it was being reprinted in 1992 for classic Star Wars coming up soon, or at least hopefully knowing that that was in the works, and knowing that Rebel Mission to Ord Mantell came out in 1983, again telling a similar story, West End Games, the Star Wars RPG licensee who wound up essentially carrying on Star Wars for a long time, the Dark Ages time, between the previous publishing contracts for comics and novels and the later contracts for publishing in novels, though not as big a gap as most people tend to give credit for. They were in the process of carrying on Star Wars, and they decided they're going to tell the same story yet again in a different way in a book entitled Scoundrels Luck. This is actually written by Troy Denning, who will go on to write quite a bit in the era once Del Rey got the contract back for Star Wars novels much later. This is a standalone adventure called a solitaire adventure. This is one of the few types of Star Wars RPG books that came out from West End Games that doesn't require dice or paper or stats or anything like that. It literally is essentially a choose-your-own-adventure book, except instead of having the choose-your-own-adventure stuff being go from one page to another, it's divided into chunks, into numbered sections, so they didn't have to waste entire pages on short little chunks. They could just have you go from section to section to section. Fun book. There's actually 3 of these. We'll see some other ones later on, possibly in some of our spin-off material, perhaps. I know I've done a review of them previously on some other podcasts and such I've been involved with, but this also tells a story with Alfreda Goot, this individual wearing Mandalorian armor who is eventually expanded upon in some of the materials by Abel Pena and such. Some of those little RPG materials, news or magazine, Star Wars Insider, like History of the Mandalorians type articles and such. But once again, another one telling the same story. So the question now becomes, of course, is this an essential read? And it sort of depends. You know, do you need to know why it was that Han said the bounty hunter they ran into in Ord Mantell changed his mind? I actually think yes. I think that's an important piece in making sense of that beginning of The Empire Strikes Back and sort of linking it all together. Problem is we don't know which of these stories is supposed to be the right one. Instead, what they've wound up doing, and there's even one, and I believe it was in Mortal Kombat, the Marvel issue, where he just briefly runs into him. It's where he realizes that Jabba has put a bounty back on his head because the whole thing with Crimson Jack's ship and everything. You know, there's so many different ways of telling it. They basically said, well, it's not really one bounty hunter that changes his mind. It's a succession of bounty hunters that change his mind. It's just he maybe is referring to the last one. Though which was the last one? So if you want to take this, because it is the more mainstream of the bounty hunter encounters, you want to take this as the one to follow, then yes, I would actually say that this is an essential read. On the other hand, if you think any of the other ones are the one that you should be paying attention to, then those become essential reads instead. I would say instead that this is the one, because it's the one most people refer to. When they think of the bounty hunter they ran into on Ord Mantell, they almost always think score. So it's not a bad start for classic Star Wars, and for that 3-volume set, finally an essential story coming out of the newspaper strips. We'll see what happens in the next round when we come back for our next episode on the newspaper strips in a little while. We got some Marvel stuff to look at first. For now, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.